It wasn't the howl of the winter wind that woke the castle, but the frantic, starving cries of the newborn heirs. Their mother, the Luna, had vanished into the snow, leaving them to die. One lowly servant dared to cross the frozen chambers to save them. This is her story. The year was 1244 of the Moon Goddess era, and Castle Blackwood stood as a brutal, stone fortress against the unforgiving northern winds of the Ironmane territory. King Silas, a fearsome alpha whose combat prowess had united the fractured western packs, was entirely absent. He was 300 miles south, waging a desperate, bloody campaign against the feral Blood Moon hordes to secure his people's borders. He had left his pregnant mate, Luna Vivienne, in the supposed safety of their ancestral stronghold, but Vivienne was not a woman built for the harsh realities of the north. Born to the wealthy, sun-drenched courts of the Sapphire Coast, she despised the perpetual cold, the smell of wet stone, and the rough-hewn manners of the Ironmane wolves. Most of all, she despised the burden of her pregnancy. On the eve of the winter solstice, as a blinding blizzard battered the castle walls, Vivienne gave birth to twins, a boy, Arthur, and a girl, Freya. Yet, there was no joy in the Luna's chambers. Less than 48 hours after the pups drew their first breath, Vivienne did the unthinkable. Under the cover of the storm, she gathered her finest furs, her jewels, and the remaining loyalty of her southern guards. She forged a letter of safe passage, slipped through the postern gate, and fled into the night to join the caravan of Lord Cedric, a rival alpha, who had long coveted both Silas's territory and his beautiful Vine Mate. She did not take the pups. They were left in their velvet-lined bassinets, entirely alone in a freezing room as the hearth fire slowly burned out to white ash. By morning, the castle was in chaos. The head nurse, Lady Agatha, discovered the abandoned room, but Agatha was a bitter, calculating woman whose loyalties lay with the southern nobility, heavily bribed by Cedric's spies before they departed. Seeing an opportunity to cripple King Silas permanently, Agatha spread a vicious lie. She claimed the Luna had been kidnapped by rogues, and that the pups, born sickly and weak, were already succumbing to the winter fever. She ordered the nursery quarantined, effectively condemning the newborn heirs to freeze and starve to death under the guise of medical isolation. Enter Clara. Clara was an Omega, the lowest-ranking wolf in the castle, employed as a scullery maid and heavily disregarded by the higher-born courtiers. She was the daughter of Tobias, the old castle woodcutter who had died of a chest infection 2 winters prior. Clara was 20 years old, dressed in patched wool, her hands calloused from scrubbing iron pots and hauling ash. But beneath her soot-stained exterior beat a heart of fierce, untamed loyalty to the pack and an instinct that could not be silenced. While fetching firewood for the kitchens, Clara heard the faint, hoarse wheezing coming from the high tower. The sound pulled at the very core of her wolf. Ignoring the explicit orders of Guard Captain Alistair and defying the quarantine, she picked the iron lock of the nursery with a rusted hairpin she used to keep her hair out of her face. The sight that greeted her would haunt her nightmares for years. The royal nursery was like an icebox. The breath of the twin pups plumed in the freezing air, their tiny faces pale and blue. Arthur was barely moving, while Freya let out pitiful, broken whimpers. Clara did not hesitate. Knowing she would be flogged or even executed for touching the royal heirs, she stripped off her thick wool cloak, wrapped both pups against her bare chest to transfer her body heat, and smuggled them down the servants' stairwell. She hid them in the cramped, drafty storage cellar beneath the kitchens, behind barrels of salted pork and sacks of winter wheat. For the first terrifying week, Clara barely slept. She spent her meager copper savings bribing Peter, the surly village goat herd, for fresh milk, sneaking out into the snow at dawn. She boiled the milk over a stolen brazier, feeding the frantic newborns drop by drop using a piece of clean linen soaked in the warm liquid. When the pups developed a rattling cough, Clara risked her life foraging in the wolf's wood. She dug through 3 feet of snow to find dormant kingsfoil and winter mint roots, brewing a pungent tea that she mixed with the milk. She sang to them in low, rumbling tones, the ancient lullabies her father had taught her, wrapping her Omega aura around them like a protective shield. Upstairs, The court moved on. Agatha sent a dark raven to the southern front, delivering a devastating message to King Silas. "Your Luna has been taken by rogues. The heirs have perished from the fever. We mourn." Down in the cellar, hidden from the treacherous politics of the nobility, life stubbornly clung on. Clara became their mother, their protector, and their entire world. She watched in exhausted awe as Arthur's eyes opened to reveal the striking, icy blue of his father, and Freya's tufts of hair grew in a soft, silvery white. As the months bled from brutal winter into the muddy thaw of spring, the pups grew strong, fat, and deeply bonded to the lowly scullery maid who had bled and starved to keep them alive. Clara knew she was living on borrowed time. She knew that eventually, the king would return, and she knew that when an alpha king finds an omega hoarding his supposedly dead children, the punishment is usually swift, bloody, and absolute. 3 months after the winter solstice, the great iron gates of Castle Blackwood shrieked open. King Silas had returned. He rode at the head of a battered, exhausted army. His armor was dented and crusted with dried blood. A vicious, jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jawbone, a souvenir from a blood moon alpha he had slaughtered. But the physical wounds were nothing compared to the aura of devastating grief that suffocated him. He had fought a war for his people, only to return to a home completely emptied of his future. Silas dismounted his warhorse, his presence causing the courtiers to drop to their knees in trembling submission. His eyes were dead, devoid of the golden alpha spark that usually commanded the room. "Show me their tombs," Silas growled, his voice like grinding stones. Lady Agatha, masking her treacherous heart with a veil of performative mourning, stepped forward. "My king." The ground was too frozen to dig. "We sealed them in the crypts beneath the sept. It is a grim sight. You should rest." "I did not ask for your counsel, Agatha." "I asked for my children," Silas snarled, shoving past her. As the royal procession moved toward the crypts, the tension in the castle was thick enough to choke on. Clara, scrubbing the flagstones in the lower bailey, felt the oppressive weight of the alpha's grief pressing down on her shoulders. The pups were currently hidden in an abandoned weaver's hut on the edge of the castle grounds, guarded by Beatrice, the head cook, who Clara had eventually been forced to trust with her secret. Silas stood before the cold stone tombs Agatha had erected. As he placed a heavy, gauntleted hand on the marble, his wolf paced restlessly in his mind. Something was wrong. The air here smelled of stale dust and damp earth, but it lacked the hollow, lingering scent of death that usually clung to a crypt. Before Silas could interrogate Agatha further, the castle was plunged into chaos. The treachery of Vivienne and Lord Cedric had not ended with her departure. Cedric knew that a grieving Silas was a vulnerable Silas. Using the blueprints Vivienne had provided, and relying on Agatha to leave the western postern gate unlatched, a highly trained unit of Cedric's mercenary assassins infiltrated Castle Blackwood under the cloak of twilight. The attack was swift and brutal. Screams erupted from the courtyard. Alarms rang out, shattering the mourning silence. Silas, his combat instincts instantly overriding his grief, drew his broadsword and charged back toward the bailey, his loyal guards rallying behind him. But the assassins weren't just aiming for the king. Agatha, realizing that Silas might eventually discover the empty tombs, had directed a splinter group of mercenaries toward the lower grounds to eliminate any loose ends specifically. The rumors she had recently heard of a scullery maid hiding something in the weaver's hut. Clara was halfway across the courtyard when she saw 3 massive, heavily armed rogues break away from the main fray and sprint toward the weaver's hut. Her blood ran ice cold. Arthur. Freya, driven by a primal, maternal instinct that entirely eclipsed her omega nature, Clara did not run for cover like the other servants. She grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from a nearby brazier and sprinted toward the hut, her bare feet slipping in the mud and slush. She reached the doorway just as the first mercenary kicked it in, sending the heavy oak crashing inward. "Cook," Beatrice screamed, cowering in the corner over the woven basket that held the twins. Well, the rogue sneered, unsheathing a serrated dagger. Looks like the rumors of the little rats surviving were true. Clara stepped into the doorway, her small frame blocking their path. She raised iron poker, her hands shaking violently, but her jaw set like stone. "You will not touch them," she hissed, her eyes flashing with a sudden, uncharacteristic golden dominance. The rogue laughed, a cruel, guttural sound, and lunged. Clara swung the heavy iron with all her might, cracking the man across the jaw. He stumbled back, spitting blood, his eyes widening in shock that a mere omega had struck him. Infuriated, he backhanded her with crushing force. Clara flew across the room, slamming into the stone wall. Pain exploded in her ribs, her vision swimming with black spots. The rogue advanced on the basket. The pups began to wail a high, piercing sound that cut through the sounds of battle outside. "No!" Clara screamed. She threw herself forward, wrapping her body entirely over the basket, acting as a human shield. The rogue raised his dagger, ready to plunge it through her back. Suddenly, the air in the room vanished. The atmospheric pressure dropped so violently that the windows shattered inward. A terrifying, monstrous roar shook the very foundations of the hut. King Silas filled the doorway, his eyes glowing a blinding, lethal gold. He had tracked the scent of strange wolves to this corner of his keep, but what he saw froze the blood in his veins. An assassin standing over a bleeding servant girl, and, beneath her, the unmistakable, frantic cries of his own bloodline. In a blur of motion, Silas crossed the room. He didn't just kill the mercenary, he dismantled him, tearing the rogue's throat out before the man could even swing his blade. The other two assassins, rushing in from behind, were met by Guard Captain Alistair and Silas's men, cut down in seconds. The room fell dead silent, save for the heavy, ragged breathing of the Alpha King and the whimpers of the infants. Silas dropped his bloodied sword. He fell to his knees beside the girl who was curled into a protective ball. She was battered, bleeding from a gash on her forehead, her breathing shallow. "Let me see them," Silas whispered, his voice trembling, breaking completely. Clara, fighting through the haze of pain, slowly uncurled her body. She looked up at the terrifying Alpha King, expecting to be struck down for her insolence. Instead, she saw tears tracking through the grime and blood on his face. Silas reached into the basket. He pulled out Arthur, then Freya, cradling them against his massive chest. They were healthy. They were warm. They smelled of goat's milk, wild herbs, and her. Silas turned his gaze to Clara. For the first time, he truly looked at her. As he breathed in, the scent of the room hit him copper from the blood, the damp wood of the hut, and beneath it all, a rich, intoxicating aroma of rain-soaked earth and cedarwood. It was a scent that bypassed his logic and struck directly at his soul. His wolf howled in his mind, slamming against his ribs. The mate bond, dormant and entirely deadened during his disastrous, arranged marriage to Vivian, suddenly ignited like a wildfire. "Mate," his wolf roared. "Protector. Mate." Silas reached out a trembling hand, gently brushing the hair away from Clara's bleeding forehead. The moment his skin touched hers, a jolt of electricity surged through them both, causing Clara to gasp. "You." Silas breathed, his eyes wide with a mixture of reverence, shock, and a sudden, fierce possessiveness. "You saved my lineage. You saved my heart." Clara could barely keep her eyes open, the adrenaline finally fading, leaving only agonizing pain. I just couldn't let them be cold," she whispered, right before the darkness claimed her. As Silas gathered the unconscious Omega into his arms, holding her just as tightly as his children, he looked over his shoulder at his stunned guards. "Seal the castle," the Alpha King commanded, his voice echoing with absolute, terrifying authority. "Arrest Lady Agatha, and fetch the royal physician. If this woman dies, the entire medical wing hangs." Clara awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of absolute, encompassing warmth. She gasped, her eyes flying open, expecting the damp stone ceiling of the weaver's hut or the freezing draft of the root cellar. Instead, she stared up at a canopy of deep crimson velvet embroidered with the golden crest of the Iron Mane pack. The mattress beneath her was stuffed with down, a luxury she had only ever heard the older servants whisper about. Panic seized her throat. "Arthur! Freya!" she choked out, attempting to sit up. Fire laced through her ribs, and she collapsed back against the pillows with a whimper. "Peace, little wolf. They are safe." The voice, a deep, gravelly baritone, rumbled from the corner of the room. Clara turned her head, wincing. King Silas sat in a high-backed leather chair beside the roaring hearth. He had shed his bloodied armor, wearing only a loose linen tunic and dark breeches, but he looked no less imposing. In his massive, scarred arms, he held both twins, completely dwarfing their small bodies. They were fast asleep, their tiny hands clutching the fabric of his shirt. Standing near the door was Physician Harrison, a stoic man known throughout the Western Territories for his surgical precision. He offered Clara a tight, respectful nod, a gesture no highborn wolf had ever directed at her before quietly slipping out of the royal chambers. "You have 3 fractured ribs, a severe concussion, and you are dangerously malnourished," Silas said, rising slowly so as not to wake the infants. He crossed the cavernous room and sat on the edge of the mattress. The sheer proximity of the Alpha King made Clara's Omega instincts scream in submission. Yet, confusingly, another instinct, something ancient and warm, pulled her toward him. "My king," Clara whispered, attempting to lower her gaze and bare her neck in traditional deference. "I am sorry. I broke the quarantine. I stole food from the kitchens. I know the punishment for an Omega touching the royal bloodline is—" "Stop," Silas commanded, though the word lacked its usual sharp edge. It was entirely gentle. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently tracing the line of her uninjured cheek. The same electric jolt from the weaver's hut flared between them, raising the hairs on Clara's arms. "You did not break a quarantine, Clara," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre. "You bypassed an assassination. Lady Agatha confessed in the dungeons an hour ago. She and my former mate, Vivienne, colluded with Lord Cedric of the Sapphire Coast. They intended for my children to freeze to death so Cedric's future heirs would face no challengers for my lands." Clara stared at him, horror pooling in her stomach. A mother left them to die? Silas's jaw clenched, his icy blue eyes darkening. She was no mother. She was a political parasite. "You are their mother. Clara, the bond these pups have with you. I can feel it through my own blood tie to them. They reek of your scent, and they scream whenever Harrison tries to take them from this room." Silas leaned closer, the scent of rain-soaked earth and cedarwood overwhelming his senses once again. "And there is something else. Something I thought the moon goddess had cruelly denied me. When the frost breaks and the false crown falls, the true heart of the pack shall be found in the ashes." The ancient prophecy of the first Ironmane Alpha. Silas quoted the old scripture, his gaze locked on hers. "My marriage to Vivienne was arranged by the High Council to end a border war. There was no bond, but you, Clara. The moment I touched you in that hut, my wolf recognized you. You are my fated mate." The room spun. Clara pressed her hands to her face. No, my king, that is impossible. I am a scullery maid. I am an Omega, the lowest of the low. The Council of Elders will never accept me. Lord Reginald and Lady Margaret would sooner see the castle burn than kneel to an Omega Luna. "Let them burn." "Then," Silas growled, a terrifying, possessive rumble vibrating in his chest. "I have bled for this territory. I have fought feral hordes to keep these cowardly nobles safe in their silk-lined keeps. I will not let them dictate the fate of my soul, nor the woman who saved my children." He gently placed Arthur and Freya on the mattress beside Clara. As soon as the pups felt her presence, they wriggled closer, burying their faces into her side with contented sighs. Silas leaned down and pressed a reverent kiss to Clara's bandaged forehead. "Rest, my true mate. Tomorrow, I cleanse this castle of its rot, and then we prepare for war, because Cedric will not take the failure of his assassins lightly." News of Lady Agatha's execution for high treason sent shockwaves through the Ironmane territory. but it was the king's subsequent decree that shattered the very foundation of their society. Silas formally declared Clara, an unranked Omega, as his fated mate and the future Luna of the pack. The nobility was outraged. Whispers of a bewitched king and an opportunistic rat echoed through the grand halls. Lord Reginald, the wealthiest of the northern lords, openly threatened to withdraw his troops from Silas's army, but the impending civil war was abruptly halted by a much larger, darker threat. Exactly 1 month after Silas's return, the warning horns of the southern watchtowers blew a frantic, terrifying rhythm. Lord Cedric had marched on Castle Blackwood. He brought with him a massive army of heavily armored mercenaries, and riding beside him on a white palfrey was Vivienne. Cedric's forces set up a siege line just beyond the tree line. Under the strict laws of the old code, Cedric demanded a parley at the castle gates. Silas rode out on his black warhorse, clad in heavy chainmail, his broadsword strapped to his back. To the absolute horror of the watching nobility, he did not ride out alone. Clara rode beside him on a gentle roan mare. She wore a gown of deep sapphire and silver, a thick fur cloak draped over her shoulders. She was terrified, her hands shaking on the leather reins, but she kept her chin held high, fiercely guarding the carriage behind them that held the royal twins. Cedric sneered as they approached. He was a handsome man, but his features were sharp and cruel. Beside him, Vivienne looked every bit the radiant, untouchable southern queen. "Silas," Cedric called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "I see you survived the Blood Moon hordes. A pity. It would have saved us all this unpleasantness." "State your business, Cedric, before I mount your head on my battlements," Silas replied, his alpha aura flaring so violently that Cedric's horse danced back in panic. Vivienne spurred her horse forward. "I have come for my children, Silas," she declared smoothly, projecting her voice so the Iron Mane soldiers on the walls could hear. "You went mad with war. You locked me out of the castle in a blizzard and stole my pups. The High Council of the Southern Coasts has granted me full custody. Hand them over, and Cedric will spare your miserable fortress." It was a brilliant, wicked lie. By painting Silas as a mad tyrant, Vivienne gave Cedric the legal pretext to conquer the territory under the guise of rescuing the heirs. Silas let out a dark, booming laugh. "You abandoned them to the frost, you treacherous coward, and now you want them back to legitimize Cedric's claim to my throne?" Vivienne's eyes flashed with anger. She dismounted and walked toward the carriage, unleashing her Luna command, a psychic weight designed to force submission from younger wolves. "Arthur! Freya! Come to your mother!" Inside the carriage, the pups began to wail in distress, but they did not move toward the door. They shrank back. Clara could not watch any longer. Slipping off her horse, she stepped between Vivienne and the carriage. "Get out of my way, servant," Vivienne hissed, her eyes glowing with alpha-blooded fury. "You are an Omega. You are dirt beneath my boots." Vivienne shoved her Luna aura entirely onto Clara, expecting the smaller woman to drop to her knees and expose her throat. But Clara did not fall, driven by the primal need to protect the pups. Clara's suppressed wolf surged to the surface. It wasn't the aggressive, dominating force of an alpha. It was something rarer, something the history books called the empathic shield. A brilliant, pure white aura erupted from Clara, washing over the courtyard. It was heavy, warm, and entirely suffocating to malevolence. Vivienne gasped, stumbling backward as her own dark aura was effortlessly repelled and shattered by Clara's overwhelming protective light. The Iron Mane soldiers on the walls, feeling the profound, maternal warmth of Clara's power, instinctively bowed their heads. "They are not yours," Clara said, her voice ringing clear and steady across the frozen mud. "You gave up your right to them the moment you walked into the snow. They are Iron Mane, and I will die before I let you use them." Silas dismounted, his chest swelling with immense pride. He stepped past Clara, drawing his broadsword, the steel singing in the crisp air. "The deception ends here, Cedric," Silas roared. "I invoke the right of blood and earth. Single combat, your life for your army's retreat, and the permanent severance of this woman's ties to my lands. Cedric paled. He was a tactician, a politician, not a frontline warrior like Silas, but to refuse a blood challenge in front of his own army would strip him of his alpha status instantly. Trembling, Cedric drew his own blade and dismounted. The duel was not a fight. It was an execution. It lasted less than 3 minutes. Silas fought with the pent-up fury of a betrayed mate and a father who had almost lost everything. He parried Cedric's desperate strikes with contemptuous ease, finally shattering Cedric's sword with a devastating overhead blow. Silas kicked the Southern Alpha to his knees, pressing the edge of his blade against Cedric's throat. "Yield!" Silas growled, his eyes bleeding gold. "I yield!" Cedric shrieked, dropping his broken hilt. Silas sneered in disgust. He did not kill him. Instead, he struck Cedric across the face with the heavy pommel of his sword, permanently breaking the Alpha's jaw and shattering his fangs, an irreversible mark of defeat and submission in the wolf world. Vivienne screamed, turning to her southern guards to command them to attack, but the mercenaries, seeing their employer broken and sensing the overwhelming, united power of Silas and Clara's combined auras, lowered their weapons and began to retreat. Vivienne was left standing alone in the mud, abandoned by the very forces she had sold her soul to command. Silas turned his back on them. He walked over to Clara, who was trembling, her glowing white aura slowly fading back into her skin. Right there, in the blood-stained snow of the courtyard, King Silas dropped to one knee before the scullery maid. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a circlet of woven black iron and moonstones. "You protected my blood when I could not," Silas said loudly, ensuring every noble, soldier, and servant heard him. "You showed us that strength is not just in the swing of a sword, but in the endurance of the heart. Be my equal. Be my true mate." Clara looked at the terrifying, beautiful Alpha King, then at the carriage where Arthur and Freya were finally quiet. Tears spilled over her cheeks as she nodded. Silas placed the crown upon her head, and as he stood to kiss her, a deafening howl of approval erupted from the castle walls, echoing across the valley. The winter storms of the Ironmane territory no longer whispered of betrayal and death. They howled with the strength of a united pack, led not by a fragile southern rose, but by the fierce, unyielding spirit of an Omega who dared to love. Clara proved that true nobility isn't born from golden crowns or wealthy bloodlines, but forged in the freezing dark, protecting the innocent when the world turns away.